On April the 29th, 1945, American soldiers from the 45th Infantry Division liberated a prisoner of war camp in southern Bavaria, Germany. A military photographer captured what appeared to be a triumphant moment. Dozens of Allied POWs standing outside their barracks, American flags waving, soldiers celebrating, the gates thrown open. The image was published in newspapers across America with headlines celebrating liberation, freedom, and victory. For 76 years, this photograph remained in archives as a symbol of Allied triumph, one of thousands of liberation images from the final days of World War II in Europe. But in 2021, when the National POW Museum commissioned high-resolution digital scans of original military photographs for their online archive, a restoration specialist named David Chen noticed something in this particular image that had been invisible in the grainy newsprint reproductions published in 1945. Something in the prisoners' faces, something in their eyes, their posture, their expressions, something that revealed the photograph wasn't showing relief at all. Subscribe now, because what this photograph actually captured was trauma so profound that freedom couldn't erase it. And the truth is written in every face. David Chen had worked in photographic restoration and archival digitization for 12 years, specializing in World War II military photography. In March 2021, the National POW Museum in New Orleans hired his firm to create ultra-high-resolution scans of 847 original photographs from the Army Signal Corps collection. Images taken by military photographers documenting the final months of the European theater. The photograph arrived as part of a collection from the 45th Infantry Division's records. The original print measured 8 by 10 inches, standard for military documentation. The back bore an official stamp. U.S. Army Signal Corps, 29th of April 1945, Stalag 7. A Liberation, Moosburg, Germany. Photographer, Private James Morrison. The image showed approximately 40 to 50 men standing and sitting in front of wooden barracks. In the background, American soldiers moved about. An American flag hung prominently. The scene appeared celebratory, the moment of liberation captured on film. David's process involved scanning original photographs at 4,800 dpi, far exceeding the resolution of period newspaper reproduction, approximately 150 to 200 dpi. This extreme resolution revealed details completely invisible in lower quality versions, individual threads in fabric, subtle facial expressions, background elements lost in printing. As David began the standard restoration process, removing scratches, correcting exposure, enhancing contrast, he zoomed in to work on individual sections of the image. Standard procedure involved examining faces closely to ensure clarity. He started with a group of 4 men standing in the center foreground, presumably positioned there by the photographer as the focal point. These men stood closest to the camera, most clearly visible, likely selected because they appeared most presentable for the photograph. David enhanced the first man's face and stopped. The man was staring directly at the camera, but his expression wasn't relief or joy. His eyes were sunken deeply into his skull, surrounded by dark circles. His face showed profound emaciation, cheekbones protruding sharply, temples hollow, skin stretched tight over bone structure. But most disturbing was his expression, completely blank, not stunned, not processing, just empty. David moved to the second man's face. Similar emaciation, similar sunken eyes. This man's mouth was slightly open, jaw slack. His gaze was unfocused, looking toward the camera but not at it. His expression suggested he was present physically but absent mentally. The third man showed a different expression. His mouth was pulled into what might technically be called a smile, but his eyes showed no corresponding emotion. The smile appeared reflexive, performative, the facial movement of smiling without the internal experience of happiness. His eyes looked past the camera, vacant. The fourth man wasn't looking at the camera at all. His head was turned slightly to the side, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance. His face showed not emptiness, but something worse. Conscious awareness of horror. His expression suggested someone actively reliving traumatic memory while physically present in a different moment. David systematically examined every visible face in the photograph. Approximately 40 faces were clear enough for detailed analysis. Not a single face showed genuine relief, happiness, or joy. Instead, David documented 17 men with completely blank, dissociated expressions. 12 men with 1,000-yard stares, eyes open but unfocused, gazing at nothing. 8 men with expressions suggesting active psychological distress. 3 men with inappropriate affect, smiling but with dead eyes. Not one single expression of authentic relief or happiness. This wasn't a liberation photograph. This was a document of mass psychological trauma. These men were technically free, but their faces showed they were still imprisoned, trapped inside experiences that freedom couldn't immediately erase. David Chen immediately contacted Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a historian specializing in POW experiences and trauma at the National World War II Museum. He sent her the high-resolution restoration files with a note. "I think this photograph is showing something different than what the 1945 caption claimed. These men don't look liberated, they look destroyed." Dr. Morrison examined the images and recognized immediately what David had discovered. "This is textbook presentation of severe psychological trauma," she explained. "What you're seeing in these faces is dissociation, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and acute stress response. These are men whose nervous systems are still in survival mode, even though the immediate threat has ended." Dr. Morrison identified the location as Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Bavaria, one of the largest POW camps in Germany, holding approximately 76,000 prisoners at liberation, including 30,000 Americans. The camp was designed for 10,000 prisoners maximum. By April 1945, it was operating at 760% over capacity. The 45th Infantry Division liberated Stalag 7A on April 29, 1945, exactly 1 week before Germany's unconditional surrender. Private James Morrison, the photographer, would have arrived with the first wave of American troops. Dr. Morrison pulled Morrison's other photographs from that day. He had taken approximately 60 images documenting the liberation. The pattern David noticed appeared in every single photograph containing close-up faces of POWs. Not one showed authentic relief or joy. Dr. Morrison then cross-referenced the photograph with Stalag 7. A prisoner records, attempting to identify specific individuals. The barracks shown in the photograph were in the American officers section, meaning these were likely Army Air Force officers, predominantly bomber crew members shot down over Germany. Using unit patches visible in some uniforms, combined with liberation records and post-war documentation, Dr. Morrison eventually identified 12 of the men in the photograph. Their stories revealed why their faces looked the way they did. One identified man was Captain Robert Bob Henderson, 24, a B-17 pilot shot down over Germany in October 1943. Henderson spent 18 months as a POW. His post-war medical records documented severe malnutrition. He weighed 112 pounds at liberation, down from 165 pounds at capture. Chronic dysentery, frostbite damage to 3 toes, and what his military doctors described as severe nervous condition. Henderson required 6 months of hospitalization after liberation before being declared fit for discharge. Another identified man was First Lieutenant James Parker, 22, a B-24 navigator shot down in March 1944. Parker spent 13 months as a POW. His post-liberation interview, conducted by Army Intelligence in May 1945, described frequent beatings, inadequate food, forced labor, and witnessing multiple executions of prisoners accused of escape attempts. Parker's medical records noted acute anxiety state and insomnia with violent nightmares. He was hospitalized for psychological care for 4 months. A third identified man was Captain Michael Sullivan, 26, a B-17 bombardier shot down in August 1943. Sullivan spent 20 months as a POW. His liberation medical exam documented weighing 98 pounds, down from 170, severe vitamin deficiency causing partial blindness, and psychiatric evaluation describing extreme emotional withdrawal and dissociative symptoms. Sullivan required 8 months of medical and psychiatric treatment before discharge. Dr. Morrison found similar patterns in every identified prisoner's records. Extreme weight loss, averaging 35 to 50 pounds, medical complications from malnutrition and disease, and psychological symptoms that 1940s military medicine described variously as combat fatigue, nervous exhaustion, anxiety neurosis, or war neurosis. Terms that would later be understood as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though that diagnosis didn't exist until 1980. These men's faces reflected not just their POW experience, but a deeper truth. Liberation didn't heal trauma. Freedom didn't erase memory. Opening the gates didn't open the psychological prisons these men had been forced to build inside themselves to survive. To understand the faces in the liberation photograph, Dr. Morrison compiled extensive documentation of conditions at Stalag 7A during the final year of the war, when most of the photographed prisoners were held there. Stalag 7A was established in 1939 as a POW camp near Moosburg, Bavaria, designed to hold 10,000 prisoners. By April 1945, it held 76,000. A seven-fold overcapacity that made basic human dignity impossible. The camp contained prisoners from multiple Allied nations: Americans, British, French, Soviets, Italians, after Italy's 1943 surrender, and others. American prisoners, mostly Army Air Force personnel shot down over Germany, were technically protected by the Geneva Convention, but those protections became increasingly meaningless as Germany collapsed. Food rations decreased dramatically during 1944 to 45. Official records show daily rations per prisoner by early 1945 consisted of approximately 300 grams of black bread, made partially from sawdust, 1 liter of thin soup, mostly water with occasional potato or turnip pieces, occasional small portions of margarine or ersatz jam. Total daily caloric intake: approximately 900 to 1,200 calories for men performing physical labor and trying to survive in unheated barracks during Bavarian winter. For comparison, the U.S. Army calculated that soldiers in combat conditions required approximately 4,000 to 4,500 calories daily. POWs were receiving less than 1/3 of that amount. Red Cross food parcels, intended to supplement camp rations, became increasingly rare during 1944 to 45 as German transportation infrastructure collapsed under Allied bombing. When parcels arrived, they were often confiscated by guards or redistributed, stolen. Many prisoners reported receiving no Red Cross parcels for months at a time during the final winter of the war. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The camp hospital had inadequate supplies, no medicines, and overwhelmed staff. Dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, and vitamin deficiency diseases were epidemic. Prisoners with serious illnesses or injuries had no treatment options beyond rest, which was impossible in overcrowded barracks. Barracks conditions deteriorated catastrophically during the final year. Designed for 200 to 300 men, barracks housed 800 to 1,000. Men slept in shifts because there wasn't sufficient floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Sanitation collapsed, latrines overflowed, water was contaminated, lice and rats were everywhere. During winter 1944 to 45, prisoners had no heat and inadequate clothing. Many had been shot down in summer or fall and captured in lightweight flight suits, never receiving proper winter clothing. Frostbite was common. Several prisoners lost toes or fingers to cold injury. Psychological conditions were equally devastating. Prisoners lived with constant hunger, the perpetual mental and physical degradation of starvation, where every thought centers on food, where the body consumes its own muscle tissue, where hunger becomes physical pain. Helplessness, complete lack of control over any aspect of existence when you eat, sleep, move, work. Every action controlled by captors. Uncertainty. No reliable information about the war's progress, when or if liberation might come, whether they'd survive to see it. Witness to death. Regular deaths from disease, malnutrition, cold, occasional executions. Bodies removed from barracks each morning. Dehumanization, treatment as numbers rather than individuals. Verbal abuse, occasional physical violence, systematic denial of dignity. Isolation, no contact with families for months or years. No knowledge of whether loved ones knew they were alive. These conditions existed for months or years. Captain Sullivan endured them for 20 months. Captain Henderson for 18 months. Lieutenant Parker for 13 months. And these were the survivors. Men strong enough, lucky enough, resilient enough to still be alive on April 29th, 1945. Liberation records indicate approximately 1,200 prisoners at Stalag 7A died during the final 6 months of the war, dying of disease, starvation, or exposure in the weeks and months before freedom arrived. The men in the photograph survived. But survival came at a cost written clearly in their faces. What happened to the men in the photograph after liberation reveals that opening the gates was only the beginning of a much longer journey, and for some, freedom came too late. When the 45th Infantry Division liberated Stalag 7A on April the 29th, 1945, they immediately provided emergency medical care, food, water, and began processing prisoners for evacuation. But the military quickly discovered that feeding starving men required extreme care. Refeeding syndrome, where malnourished bodies can't process sudden normal nutrition, killed several liberated prisoners who ate too much too quickly. Captain Henderson's post-liberation medical records document this carefully managed refeeding process. Patient given small portions light food every 2 to 3 hours. Extremely hungry but becomes violently ill if allowed to eat normal portions. Digestive system severely compromised by extended malnutrition. Most prisoners from Stalag 7A were evacuated to field hospitals, then to larger military hospitals in France or England, and finally transported back to the United States between May and July 1945. The journey home took weeks to months, as medical staff determined who was stable enough for transport. Henderson reached the United States in June 1945, was hospitalized at an Army facility in New Jersey for 6 months, and discharged in December 1945. His discharge papers noted service-connected disabilities, chronic gastric distress, peripheral neuropathy, nerve damage from malnutrition, anxiety disorder. Henderson attempted to return to normal life. He enrolled in college using the GI Bill. He married his girlfriend from before the war. He tried to build the post-war life millions of veterans were building. But Henderson's wife's letters to his family, preserved in his personal papers, now archived, describe the reality. Bob doesn't sleep through the night. He has terrible nightmares. He can't eat normally. His stomach problems persist. He's withdrawn and won't talk about the war. He startles at loud noises. He seems haunted. In 1947 letters, his wife wrote, "Bob was hospitalized again. The doctors say it's his nerves. They're trying different treatments. He's having a very difficult time." Henderson never fully recovered. He lived until 1973, dying at age 52 from complications of alcoholism, a disease he developed while trying to self-medicate his psychological symptoms. His family described him as never the same after the war. Lieutenant Parker's trajectory was similar. After 4 months of psychiatric hospitalization in 1945, he was discharged and returned home to Ohio. He married, had 2 children, and worked as an insurance salesman. But Parker's daughter, interviewed by Dr. Morrison in 2021, described her father as emotionally distant, prone to angry outbursts, couldn't handle stress, drank heavily. Parker died in 1968 at age 45 from a heart attack. His death certificate noted chronic alcoholism as a contributing factor. Captain Sullivan's outcome was worse. After 8 months of treatment, he was discharged in early 1946. He attempted college but dropped out after 1 semester. He worked various jobs but couldn't maintain employment. His psychiatric symptoms worsened. In 1949, he was voluntarily admitted to a Veterans Administration psychiatric hospital, where he remained institutionalized for the rest of his life. He died in a VA psychiatric facility in 1971 at age 52. Not all the identified prisoners had tragic outcomes. 3 of the 12 identified men lived relatively normal lives, married, had careers, raised families. But even they described in later oral history interviews persistent nightmares, difficulty with food and eating, startle responses, and avoidance of anything related to their POW experience. One survivor, interviewed in 1992, said, "People think liberation was the end of it. It wasn't. It was just the beginning of trying to live with what we survived. That was harder than surviving itself." The photograph captured the moment these men learned they were physically free. But their faces revealed a truth the 1945 newspapers didn't report. Many of them would never truly be free from what they experienced. Liberation opened the gates. But it couldn't open the psychological prisons these men would carry inside themselves for the rest of their lives. David Chen and Dr. Morrison's analysis of the Stalag 7. A liberation photograph sparked broader examination of liberation photography from World War II. Their findings revealed a systematic pattern. Wartime photography and journalism focused on liberation as triumph while largely erasing evidence of trauma visible in the images themselves. Dr. Morrison examined 340 liberation photographs from various POW camps across Germany, taken by Army Signal Corps photographers between March and May 1945. She found, in newspaper reproduction, headlines emphasized victory, freedom, and relief. Captions described prisoners as joyful, celebrating, or grateful. Photos were selected and cropped to emphasize American flags, smiling soldiers, and any prisoners who appeared relatively healthy. In original high-resolution images, systematic evidence of trauma, malnutrition, psychological distress, and dissociation visible in prisoners' faces and body language, but lost in low-resolution newsprint reproduction and obscured by selective captioning. The wartime media narrative required liberation to be triumphant, Dr. Morrison explained. American audiences needed to see the war effort as successful, righteous, and worthwhile. Showing the profound trauma of liberated prisoners would have complicated that narrative. So photographers captured what was actually there, but editors selected images and wrote captions that emphasized what audiences expected to see rather than what was actually visible in the photographs. Private Morrison, the photographer who took the Stalag 7A image, survived the war and worked as a newspaper photographer in Pennsylvania until his death in 1987. His grandson, contacted by Dr. Morrison in 2021, shared Morrison's personal photo albums and diaries. Morrison's diary entry from April 29, 1945 read, "Liberated POW camp today, ordered to photograph prisoners for documentation and publicity. The men looked like walking corpses, hollow eyes, skeletal faces. Many could barely stand. They were technically happy. We freed them, but they didn't look happy. They looked destroyed. I took photos showing their faces clearly, but I don't think newspapers will print what I actually saw. Command wants liberation to look victorious. These men don't look victorious. They look like they've been through hell and can't find their way back." Morrison's personal photo album contained unofficial photographs he took for himself, images that were never submitted for official distribution. These images showed extreme close-ups of prisoners' faces, documentation of medical conditions, and scenes of prisoners breaking down emotionally after liberation. Morrison's handwritten captions on these personal photos read, "What liberation actually looked like." In 2022, the National WWWI Museum created an exhibit titled Liberation and Trauma, The Faces Freedom Couldn't Heal, featuring the Stalag 7. A photograph alongside David Chen's high-resolution analysis, POW testimonies, medical records, and context about psychological trauma. The exhibit includes side-by-side comparison. The 1945 newspaper reproduction with caption, "Joyful American POWs Celebrate Liberation," next to the high-resolution restoration showing the same image with caption, "Traumatized American, POWs show signs of severe psychological distress immediately following liberation." The exhibit attracted significant attention, particularly from veterans' families who recognized their own family stories in the documentation. Multiple families contacted the museum to share similar experiences. Relatives who returned from POW camps, never the same, who struggled with psychological symptoms for decades, who were told to get over it or move on, who internalized shame about their inability to simply be grateful for survival and return to normal life. One visitor, the daughter of a Stalag 7 survivor, wrote in the museum's comment book, "My father was in this camp. He never talked about it. He drank, had nightmares, couldn't hold jobs. I grew up thinking something was wrong with him. Now I understand. Something was done to him. This exhibit gave me the context I needed to understand my father's life and forgive his struggles." The 1945 liberation photograph from Stalag 7A now serves a purpose beyond its original documentation intent. It has become evidence of a truth that took 76 years and high-resolution technology to fully reveal. Liberation was not the end of suffering for POWs. It was often just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Modern understanding of trauma, informed by decades of research into PTSD, combat stress, and psychological injury, allows us to see what 1945 viewers couldn't recognize. The faces in this photograph show men experiencing acute trauma responses. Their blank expressions, thousand-yard stares, and emotional disconnection weren't personal weakness or poor attitude. They were neurological and psychological responses to prolonged extreme stress, malnutrition, helplessness, and repeated exposure to death and suffering. In 1945, American culture lacked framework for understanding this. The prevailing attitude toward psychological war injury was stigmatizing. Men were expected to tough it out, not dwell on it, and get back to normal. Seeking psychological help was seen as weakness. Many returning POWs internalized this message and struggled in silence rather than risk being perceived as weak or damaged. Captain Henderson, Lieutenant Parker, Captain Sullivan, and thousands of other POW survivors lived in an era that told them, "You survived, you're free, you should be grateful, move on." When they couldn't simply move on, when nightmares persisted, when normal eating remained difficult, when crowds triggered panic, when they couldn't hold jobs or maintain relationships, they blamed themselves. They believed their inability to get over it reflected personal failure rather than normal response to extraordinary trauma. It would take until 1980, 35 years after World War II ended, for post-traumatic stress disorder to be recognized as an official diagnosis. By then, many World War II POW survivors had already lived decades with untreated psychological injuries. Many had self-medicated with alcohol. Many had died without ever receiving appropriate care or validation that their struggles were legitimate war injuries deserving of treatment and respect. The photograph cannot change their experiences. The men in the image lived their lives. Henderson died in 1973. Parker in 1968, Sullivan in 1971. Most of the other identified prisoners have also passed away. The photograph cannot give them the care they needed but didn't receive. But the photograph can change our understanding. It can teach current and future generations that freedom doesn't erase trauma, that liberation is a beginning rather than an ending, that healing requires resources beyond simply removing the source of harm. The photograph is now used in military training programs, teaching trauma recognition. It's used in veteran support programs, illustrating the normality of struggling after liberation from traumatic circumstances. It's used in historical education, showing the gap between wartime propaganda narratives and actual human experiences of war. David Chen continues to restore World War II photographs. He now specifically looks for evidence of trauma in liberation images, recognizing that historical photographs contain information beyond what their original captions claimed, and that modern analysis can reveal truths that period interpretation missed or deliberately obscured. Dr. Morrison published a book in 2023, Beyond the Gates, POW Liberation and the Long Road to Healing in World War II. The Stalag 7. A photograph appears on the cover. The book documents dozens of prisoners' post-liberation experiences, challenging simplistic narratives of liberation as purely triumphant. The photograph itself remains what it always was: 40 men standing in front of barracks on April 29, 1945, the day they were freed from captivity. But what we see in their faces has changed. We no longer see relief. We see what was actually there all along. Trauma written in eyes that had seen too much, in faces too thin from hunger, in expressions frozen somewhere between survival mode and the terrifying uncertainty of trying to imagine a future beyond simply staying alive. Sometimes photographs tell us what we want to see. Sometimes they tell us what we need to see, and sometimes, if we look closely enough, they tell us what was always there waiting to be recognized. Suffering so profound that even freedom couldn't immediately heal it. But recognition is the first step toward healing. And 76 years later, these men's faces can finally receive the understanding they deserved in 1945. Sometimes that's justice. Sometimes that's all we can offer. And sometimes, even that matters.